Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be painting this elf from Warhammer Quest. He's one of the 4 characters that came in the core box, and unlike the other characters that have very strong options available to them, like the dwarf is excellent in melee combat. He's just extremely tough. The barbarian is more of a damage dealing character. He can wield a large variety of weapons in the game, which is great. Plus, he can go frenzy when needed, although this doesn't always work out. But that's just how Warhammer Quest is. And then the wizard is more of a sort of damage dealing comes healing kind of miniature. I think the elf is interesting because the elf's specialty is really being versatile and being able to pick off enemy characters that are sort of lurking in the backs of units. He really comes into his own a little bit when you start to encounter wizards, because generally speaking, wizards will spawn in a group of minions, and they tend to be shielded from you. So the warriors really need to work together to try to get to that wizard hiding at the back. Simply because, well, if you let wizards cast spells willy nilly, just really have their way with putting out spells every turn, sooner or later things are going to get really bad for the party. So we're starting out with Ildari Emerald. So this is an Athel Loren elf, as opposed to an elf of Althun. And elves are an interesting, well, they're a sort of interesting take on the idea of Tolkien elves, because while generally speaking elves more or less keep to themselves, they do kind of interact with humans in different ways in this setting. And they're not, I mean, they're not supernatural in that sense, or they're never portrayed as such. They're simply one of the various races that lives in the Warhammer world, right? They are a particularly magically inclined, skillful, long-lived race. Generally speaking, they are good at initiative. They're fast-moving, so they have a movement of 5, for example, whereas your average human has a movement of 4 for context. And they generally have really good weapon skill. They tend to hit things quite easily. Um, but defensively, they're a little bit average. They are still toughness 3, and they have generally 1 wound each for the most part across most Warhammer and Warhammer style games. So elves are an interesting archetype insofar as they tend to pair their sort of high effectiveness attacks with relatively low defense. So they are a little bit more of a glass cannon. When it came to the Wood Elf, however, for Warhammer Quest, it's interesting that this character is almost more of a tank than the Dwarf is, at least initially. He comes with a built-in dodge ability, which can then be upgraded over subsequent levels. As he gains more levels, he becomes more effective at dodging incoming attacks. But on the flip side, generally speaking, if he gets hit with a solid hit and he fails his dodge save, he's gonna take a large amount of damage, simply because this guy doesn't have that much health to start with. He definitely lags behind the barbarian and certainly lags behind the dwarf. So yeah, this guy is more of a versatile multi-role kind of strike anywhere on the tabletop, anywhere in the dungeon kind of character. And it's really nice because he comes equipped also with the ability to break pins. He doesn't get pinned by enemy in combat, so he gets to move freely around. And that, coupled with his ability to put arrows wherever he needs to go, really makes him a fine addition to any party. He's not like an amazing damage dealer without some hefty magic items to give him some kind of a boost. But he is a very useful utility character, and he's also got like the biggest, like the most important aspect of you know to sort of recommend this as a character. He's got a healing potion which totally heals any character that he uses it on, or even on himself, which is really nice. So that, coupled with his ability to break pin to get to wherever he needs, wherever your wounded friend may be, he functions really well as kind of like a first aid responder. Well, better than first aid really, because he brings the target all the way back up to full health. So yeah, it's always good to have an elf around. Very useful in that regard. And you know, all the third-party expansions made by people like Little Monk kind of have him lean further into this role. I mean, as should be the case, because I think healing being a bit thin on the ground in Warhammer Quest, generally speaking, the only models that really kind of heal with any kind of precision are things like your wizard and maybe warrior priests in a pinch. I mean, we did talk previously about how the main thing that made pit fighters absolutely amazing is the fact that they come with a heal it potion. So just the idea that your character gets a healing potion is enough to recommend them. Simply because in Warhammer Quest you do die very regularly to things that sort of dish out heavy damage. Minotaurs in particular spring to mind. They are the quintessential noob killer for many a Warhammer Quest run, and I believe that's how it was supposed to be, right? Because to be perfectly honest, the Warhammer world's a dangerous place, I suppose, and I think that's what the designers wanted to get across. Just the idea that you don't necessarily are always equipped with all the tools that you need, but you manage to scrape through somehow, and that's kind of how the elf works as well. If he rolls really well with his dodge rolls and you know the kind of defense that he gets with things like elf shields, which for example ignore the first hit that he takes in every round, or if he wears things like elf helmets, which basically give him a 6+ save against an incoming attack, that kind of thing, on top of their regular damage soaking abilities, which to be fair for elves isn't that great. Yeah, so elves actually become quite an interesting kind of skill tank kind of ability, and depending on how you choose to arm him, he can actually be quite effective at dealing damage to back rank enemy monsters who are trying to get away from your party while annoying you with things like spells and so on. So yeah, the elf is a really useful character to have along, and I really enjoy playing it. One of my main characters is an elf, the other is a witch hunter, and both of these are sufficiently different that you know it's always entertaining to take these characters into the dungeon, so to speak. So we're going to be playing with different kinds of green on this miniature. I mean, he's an Athel Loren elf, right? So it kind of makes a lot of sense to go green. But at the same time, I think green has a lot of latitude as far as how you can add value to the color scheme. So for example, we are looking at the play of two very different greens. One of them is Mantis Warriors green, which is a lot more of a yellowish green. That's that on the bottom near the hem, on the hem rather. And then the Ildari Emerald, of course, is a lot more of a blue-green. And both of these colors, I mean, I think they do wonderful work because they're both really interesting visually. They're kind of rich and eye-catching. But they're rich and eye-catching in very different ways. And even though the model overall still looks like green, I think it's possible to get a little bit of variation. And that really sort of keeps the model looking interesting rather than looking at a big swath of green on the tabletop. Unless you're trying to create some kind of a camouflage model, for elves, generally speaking, I would steer clear of camouflage green, of like olive green, because I think olive green just kind of fades away. And since you're going to be painting wood elves in this video, I think what we wanted to do was to emphasize it rather than let it sort of vanish and fade away. Make it a feature in that sense rather than just supporting cast, which colors like olive would. They kind of do it admirably, right? They do really nice as a sort of supporting cast kind of green because they recede. But yeah, I like the idea that on the wood elf at least, green should be kind of the main focal color. And we get to explore many different kinds of green, which should be a lot of fun. So I put on the Mantis Warriors green onto the edge of the cloak. It looks a bit patchy now. This is to be expected because this miniature has really large folds. So we can kind of take our time with it. I'm actually trying to avoid going too close to the adjacent emerald green areas because I still want to come in and do a second coat over this, and that will help us, you know, be a little bit more directed in how we apply our green. Let's move on to something else far away. Perhaps let's do the red for his bow. As is very often the case, a lot of miniatures in this era feature red somewhere in the color scheme. And I think the reason for this is because it just photographs really well. It draws attention to kind of the business end of a miniature. So weapons in particular often get some amount of red somewhere, whether it's a gemstone on the hilt, or in the case of bows, more often than not, they're painted red because they're so eye-catching and really look, really vibrant and interesting. I think bows, because they're by their very nature, they're very thin and sort of elegant-looking weapons. They can sort of vanish into the miniature if you do them in a sort of wood color. They have a hard time basically fighting for attention with more eye-catching things. So yeah, so red in that sense, I think it's a wonderful choice. It's a wonderful choice for this. Yeah. So yeah, Warhammer Quest. If you haven't had a chance to play it, I suggest that you track down a copy. It's possible to get hold of a lot of these in various Facebook groups. There are a lot of files that you can download, like full sets of rules. Broheim.net is still up, which is wonderful. So you can actually get hold of most of the supplements in PDF form. And all in all, it's one of my favorite Warhammer games because there's just so much content in it. Like these days, I feel like rules. I feel like they're like modern games don't give you quite as much content. Warhammer Quest in 1995 gave you both the ability to play a one-off game with just 4 starting characters, and a 5th bonus character was actually written into the rules just as a freebie, the Troll Slayer. And then once you kind of decide that you get the hang of how the basic game is played, you can then go into linked adventures, which is kind of like a campaign wherein your heroes go from dungeon to dungeon and they raise level and they kind of get more powerful and so on. So yeah, this allows you to take your characters all the way from beginner level 0 or level 1 characters all the way until you get to battle level 10. And by that point, you've basically graduated from fighting just like mobs of orcs and goblins, night goblins, that kind of thing, to all the way to fighting like bloodthirsters. Well, single bloodthirster, hopefully. Unless you roll really badly on the random encounter tables and you end up fighting many at once, which is a possibility. Not very common, but unfortunately it is a possibility. And that's just how Warhammer Quest works. Yeah, so you get so much game out of that starter core box and its initial contents. In terms of just what models you want to use, I think these days it's quite easy to get hold of miniatures of just various kinds of adversaries. And whichever adversaries you don't have, or you don't own an army of, or you are having trouble tracking down miniatures for, then fair enough, you can just leave them out, or you can use an appropriate proxy because it's your game, and you can really sort of take things the way you want them. This is Skeleton Horde, and I'm going to be applying this to his undersuit. I'm also going to be building up more than one layer of this because I think I like the idea of a sort of natural kind of uncured or less cured leather for his leggings and so on. So not quite so dark and mahogany finish, but more of a pale kind of brown color, which I think suits the woodland realm very well. Yeah, so he's coming along, a little bit wet, but that's fine. We can give it some time to sort of dry as we go along. Also notice that I missed out some spots, like this area over here on his lapel. I guess it's kind of the end of his robe, I suppose. So let's just jump in and make sure that we don't miss that. And it might be useful for us to jump in with a hairdryer in a bit. But for now, let me just see if I can work my way around some of the more finicky areas of this model. So this was a one-piece plastic sculpt. So it kind of had, that kind of splayed out layout insofar as he's got his arm directly ahead. he's all arranged in one plane, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So the upshot of that is that a lot of the details are very accessible, but every now and then you do get weird little crevices like that area there next to his arm, which you kind of need to work a little bit to reach into. So we're coming back in with the Ildari Emerald to strengthen some of it. So we are rewarded for our patience, having to deal with the slightly blotchy finish with the idea that you can layer contrast paints multiple times over to create more intense colors. And as you go, sort of applying the colors to where they are needed rather than just as an overall layer, you'll find that increasingly you'll be able to fix a lot of the inconsistencies on the surface. That's kind of how I like to use contrast paints in general. So we can keep going, intensifying the shadows until such time that we get some smooth blends. And it's really easy to achieve smooth blends with contrast paint because it's so translucent, right? So you just keep building up layers of it over time, and then maybe one or two very, very well placed or well chosen highlights at the end, just to set the whole miniature off, and that puts us in good stead. As mentioned in the past, I don't really enjoy doing highlights a lot. I find that highlights can feel like freehand sometimes if the surface of the model doesn't quite have the geometry to support what you're trying to achieve. I think for more recent models, this is less and less of a problem. But for a lot of the older models, I find that, they leave a little bit of... it leaves a little bit to the imagination as far as trying to get the contours right. But that said, it's still a lot more time consuming than coming in and adding shading to where it's needed judiciously. So I still prefer to do it this way because I feel I get a faster result, and I can paint a model more or less to tabletop standard for just within a relatively short time, and I can be happy with the result. Nothing too out of the ordinary and not too complicated, sort of good for a relaxing kind of evening session. So yeah, we are going back with the Mantis Warriors Green now, and just making sure that it builds up in the right areas. I love the play between Mantis Warriors Green and Ildari Emerald. They're so different as greens, and therefore so pleasing to put side by side because you really get to see them pop and be vibrant in their own special ways. So pretty wonderful. Jumping in with some Vallejo Silver Model Air color here. This is basically going to be the basis for all of the gold areas because he is an elf. Elves have some affinity with metalworking, so what weapons they do have are going to be extremely finely crafted. So we're going to be playing with shading this in a different color from Noun Oil, simply because we want to avoid that kind of grayness that can sometimes come from Noun Oil weapons. Nothing wrong with that, but an appropriate sort of color for an appropriate application is how I would choose to look at it. So we're going to be looking at shading it with a little bit of Gryphcharger Grey, which imparts a kind of a bluish tone to it. And then as a second shade, we're going to be thinning down some Black Templar, I think. Or maybe mixing those two colors to get a little bit more intensity in the recesses, because Gryphcharger Grey on its own can be a bit weak without the added intensity of a bit of Black Templar. So Black Templar versus Black Legion. For me, I will always choose Black Templar simply because Black Templar has a bluish tint to it and makes models generally more dynamic and interesting looking, whereas Black Legion tends to dull the figure down because it is a lot less, saturated as far as the color is concerned. It's just kind of grey. Tends to mute colors, I suppose, rather than saturating them. Which is, I think, what we want to try to do, to try to make a model look appealing and attractive from afar. The idea is that we want to build up saturation, where appropriate, of course, depending on the miniature. A lot of Warhammer Quest miniatures from this era, a lot of miniatures from this era in general, look really good in nice bright colors, so that's what we're going to be doing. Cool. So we're going to jump on to do his belt and his brooch, that thing that's holding his cape in place at his throat. So yeah, wood elves have always had this sort of yellow color about them, which is quite pleasing because yellow is a nice, strong, pronounced color that doesn't really get used on a lot of good guy factions in general. I guess you could have an Empire army that's in yellow, but generally speaking, yellow doesn't get used as a main army color. Perhaps because I don't know, it's got a reputation for being difficult to paint, which is certainly true in for paints of the era. I think a lot of the yellow pigments were not ideal. They were not very strong. They didn't go on in one coat, and they tended to kind of always need multiple coats to get any kind of real strength to the color. But I don't think that's necessarily the case anymore today with modern painting techniques like contrast paint, for example, or their equivalents. You can apply these over a light color and achieve a very strong color very quickly. These were techniques that were available back in the day as well, but I think there is something special about the kind of products that we have now. Really makes this kind of painting quite pleasurable. So I am going to take a hairdryer break because I want to come in and really detail up that cloak in a while. So yeah, see you in a bit. Okay guys, we are back. So onwards with more Ildari Emerald. I've just taken the opportunity to top up my little puddle of Ildari Emerald. So we're going to be building this up now quite strongly in the recesses to get that kind of more intense color. Now when Ildari Emerald is built up strongly, I think you can almost go entirely without a highlight because it gets to such depth that, you know, if you build it up enough, it can almost look like black from afar, which is kind of nice. I really like colors that can do this. Mantis Warriors Green, for example, can't really do this. It's just a different color in general. It's a little bit lighter, and therefore it doesn't build up to these kinds of depths easily. So there we go. Okay, so Ildari Emerald, really beautiful color, and quite unique as far as I'm concerned to any other kind of green in the Games Workshop range for contrast paint. So if you like this sort of emerald kind of deep forest green kind of color, I highly recommend this as a contrast paint. Also, it's one of the few colors, not one of the few colors, but I guess one of the colors that actually works properly like a contrast paint by building up lights and darks all within one coat. Some of the later contrast paints didn't do this as much. It didn't provide as much natural contrast out of the bottle. I think this is because, you know, there were some differences in formulation between colors, so not the most consistent range in general. But Ildari Emerald was really one of the stars for me. I think the challenge for me was to find more models where it was appropriate to use a color like Ildari Emerald, but every single time I've applied it, I've really enjoyed the process, and I think it achieves really attractive colors with, you know, not a lot of effort. So that's a really big win in my book. Okay, so I'm building this up right up to the Mantis Warriors Green now because that area is now dry, so I don't need to sort of beat around the bush. And you know, it's getting a lot less blotchy now, so thank you for staying with me, because sometimes this process, I do wonder whether people have the patience to kind of sit through, simply because it takes a while before it starts getting good. But once you do build it up properly, you do get like a really attractive result from just the use of just one color, right? Which is kind of great. Really like that idea. And this is really why I choose to paint with translucent paints. Just the idea that you can get so many different colors out of one, albeit within the same spectrum though, right? But yeah, you can get so many colors out of one bottle of paint. It's really fascinating to me. So we're going to be applying this into the recesses to kind of build up the different colors. And if you do this back and forth enough times, eventually you will get many different shades out of just one bottle, and it can sort of look like it's been highlighted. And then when you sort of come in to do that finishing touch, it really sets the whole look of the model off. So continuing to build up some more saturation in the recesses. And you can sort of see that there are areas of the model which are starting to look almost black in its intensity. Really glorious stuff. It's worthwhile learning how to do this because painting with translucent paints sets you up for so many other interesting concepts in painting, right? Like this is the basis of how glazes are used, for example, and you don't have to use contrast paint for this technique. Basically, the whole principle of glazing is to create layers of translucent paint. And what is contrast paint rather than basically a translucent paint pre-thinned out of the bottle? But really, you could be doing this with anything. People have asked me whether it's possible to paint this way using just the regular layer paints. Absolutely. This is what, in my opinion, this is what, well, I mean, not in my opinion, I was there when they did it. This is what people used to do before pre-formulated, purpose-formulated washes were done and available in large amounts easily. So people used to mix these colors like inks and watercolor-like pigments. Not actual watercolors, I mean colors that had watercolor-like pigments, which were essentially a little bit translucent. You could easily mix into very effective glazes. Just washing that part off because I got a bit of green onto his leg while I was talking. Don't mind me. And yeah, the other benefit is that if you act fast, it's easy to sort of take off mistakes, which is great because I make plenty of mistakes, as you will find out. So yeah, learn to work with translucent paints, and you'll minimize your time spent highlighting, and you can concentrate on just sort of sketching in contours in a very satisfying way, I feel. And the nice thing about this is because you're basically building up layers of color down into shadows. The model always looks like it's improving. You know, very often with the sort of shade and highlight kind of method, applying washes and so on, there can be a very pronounced ugly phase. I think the ugliest phase that we had just now was over fairly quickly, and that's because it can look a little bit blotchy at first, but if you sort of power through it, it's quite easy to get past it relative to, say, you know, highlighting and shading, which can look quite messy sometimes. So long as, you know, you sort of keep the faith, you'll eventually get a good result. But sometimes we just want to see a little bit of progress, right? So back to the Mantis Warriors Green, and we're going to be applying this carefully into the recesses. We can go right up against the Illari Emerald now because we're not worried about things being wet still. And this basically gives us a very intense saturated green, kind of like an apple green, which is really nice. And we can get this right up against the edge of the cape as well, and then decide where we want to come in with highlights to sort of enhance the look of it. If you're worried about it being slightly blotchy still, just give it a little bit of time to dry, apply a few more coats, and eventually you'll get there. So long as you keep at it. So philosophically, with people who have started painting models, I think there can be a bit of a mental block, especially since these models aren't cheap, right? There is a bit of a mental block around the idea of getting started because it always feels like you might be messing up a miniature, and nobody likes the feeling that they're messing up a miniature, right? And I think that can be very daunting for people starting to paint. I don't think that should stop us, but I completely understand the sentiment, simply because painting a miniature uses, I feel, a set of muscle movements and skills which kind of don't really get used in any other part of modern life. I mean, unless you're an artist like a person who already like sketches and or paints on canvas, I don't think a lot of these skill sets get used anywhere else in our professional life, or just as part of modern living in general. I mean, I think these days we barely write anything with a pen or pencil, so much less using something like a brush to, you know, paint onto a surface. So with that in mind, I think really one of the only real avenues to improve as a painter is to paint. Now that sounds really obvious and trite, right? Almost as though it doesn't need to be said. But really, I think the issue now is because miniatures are expensive, and we feel like we need to not mess them up. Therefore, we're often afraid to get started. And I think my solution for this is quite simply to have a board game, right? Board games come usually with a massive number of miniatures, and they're not always all of really good quality. But to be perfectly honest, there is a kind of subtle satisfaction that you can get from making a model that's not perfect look a little bit more perfect. And you're going to need to get through like dozens of them anyway. So it can be really nice to kind of have that many canvases to kind of practice some basic techniques over. Also, don't forget that you can always strip your miniatures. Nothing is really forcing you to commit to a particular look if you're not happy with the result. You can always just strip the model carefully using either Dettol or some other kind of kitchen degreasing product. Just test it first, or else shop for things that specifically do not eat into plastic. And in a pinch, I guess, if you absolutely cannot find anything that you can trust, any products that you can trust, which is fine, I would just go for isopropyl alcohol, because that usually takes the paint right off, no issues at all. So yeah, there's nothing really stopping you from having another go. I think it helps to just be patient with the process, understand that we need to pick up these skills slowly over time, and maybe just really wing it and try to enjoy the process as well. I think putting a lot of pressure on making every model look like our next best model sometimes stops us from growing as artists. Artists is a bit jumped up, but it stops us from growing as painters, and kind of impedes us from just enjoying the straightforward kind of process of painting, which to me is highly meditative and really enjoyable. Once you get past that initial self-doubt and stress, yeah, painting is really, really, really good for focusing the mind, I have found. And I hope you enjoy it as much as I do, because I paint every day now. Not just because of this channel, because I like doing commissions, I like doing my own stuff, and it's extremely pleasant and enjoyable. So let's jump into doing his face now, something that we've kind of left to uncharacteristically late in the video, but that's okay. Sometimes it helps to just do the setting before you do the jewel, so to speak. So yeah, I'm just going to put this all over his skin. This is our typical flesh mix, our usual Guilliman Flesh contrast paint plus Seraphim Sepia wash in a 1:1 kind of blend, and that actually starts to get the model looking a little bit more complete, because I think our eyes naturally gravitate towards those areas, which is why usually we do it early in the session. But for whatever reason, I chose to do it a little bit later in this one. Probably because I really wanted to get the look of that cloak just right, that cloak and cape, because it's such an important part of the model, had to come out feeling just right. Yeah, sometimes I pick models purely because I want to paint a particular thing. So in this case, I think that cloak really drew me in because I thought it was going to be really fun and really nice to do. Not too difficult, and frankly quite rewarding to get right. Okay, so we're going to come in now with a little bit of Gore-Grunter fur, and we're going to start to edge the brown areas. So this model color scheme, I did not invent this, right? So this color scheme comes from the army, comes from the boxed game itself. So this use of yellow, various shades, I would call them various shades of brown and various shades of green in different quantities, and chosen with intent to offset warmth and coldness, I suppose. It's really quite a remarkable color scheme because the final result is so vibrant and so full of life. It's kind of amazing. So we have reddish browns, we have just sort of khaki, dun kind of colors like what we get with the various levels of Skeleton Horde. That really gives us a khaki kind of dun color, kind of neutral. And then we've got different warmth of green. We've got the light stuff and then we've got the darker stuff. But then more interestingly is the fact that they vary in terms of yellow in the green itself, so they are very, very visually different and kind of, you know, quite well thought through in that sense. So it's a useful color scheme for us to do because it helps us to be more deliberate with our color choices. Teaches us that, you know, green isn't just green. Green has many different flavors, and really, if you choose correctly, there's no reason why a model that's done almost entirely in green shouldn't look as visually compelling as colors that rely more on a typical kind of contrasting pairing of colors. So not every model needs to be black and red. Not every model needs to be white and blue. It's perfectly good to try to play with different shades of green as well. You can get a fairly attractive result as a result of following this. The last green that we're going to do is a thematic blue. Yes, it's called a blue, but really this is, I'm sure you agree, this has lots of green in it. And putting it over here just on this pouch gives us one more interesting green color to look at, which is different from the other two. It's also fairly mild, so we will probably come back in to do another layer. But for now, yeah, I think it's looking pretty good. Now, as far as his hair is concerned, I think a bit of Iandan plus a little bit of the Skeleton Horde gives us a color that's kind of right for his sandy blonde hair. So let's put that right there. And we can move on to getting more of these little details done and sketched in so that this boy can be ready to raise hell in the next dungeon that he joins. So I'm going to grab a little bit of black just to ground the figure and to give a little bit of dynamic shading to that boot. I rarely use black on its own because I find that as a color it tends to kind of weaken the colors around it, but I think this is a perfectly viable backdrop for all of the other really bright colors that we have playing on the surface already. So black is a perfectly viable choice for this. So black, when used, you know, to edge bright, vibrant colors, it can make the other colors look more dynamic and visually interesting. So that helps the other colors next to it to pop. And although I don't use it very often, because I always feel that there's probably some other variation or close like neighbor to black. So for example, I often use Rattling Grime because it's a really dark brown, or Cygor brown is another one. I kind of feel like black sometimes gets a useful role to play, especially when you've got a color scheme that's already so bright and vibrant and pulling in all sorts of different directions. I'm going to go in with a bit more silver because I kind of missed this cuff that he's got on his left arm, his bow arm. And then after that we might jump in with the hairdryer again because this model is fairly wet still, and so much of this model specifically in particular relies on having colors to like layering over each other to get that kind of really nice gradated result. Yeah. So in real life, if you're painting this model as an individual, it might be useful to have other figures to work on. Otherwise, it's also okay to invest in, you know, a hairdryer so that you can sort of keep the pace of progress going and well, sometimes I guess we just want to do one model from start to finish, as we do here on this channel. Okay, I'm gonna dry this off. Back in a bit. Okay, so now that we're nice and dry, I get to come in and I can start to sketch in some of the finer details. So his eyes are actually kind of nicely done, but because of the way, you know, the contrast paint was pooling, I think it looked a little bit strange at first. So now I finally get to sketch in his eyeballs and hopefully make him look a little bit less scary, because the eyeballs on this model are actually kind of large, which is certainly a choice. Okay, cool. Next, I think we can come in and start to shade the metals a little bit. So I'm using a mix of Gryphcharger gray as well as Black Legion. Let's see how that looks. It's okay, except that capillary action is kind of making it move a little bit strangely. So let's see if we can get that to sit nicely on the surface. Kind of like that. Could be a bit cleaner, but that's a decent enough start for our purposes. Maybe we can come back in and clean it up by taking off a little bit of the excess wash. But yeah, that works fine. This will go over all the silver areas, so that includes his mighty belt. It sits over his frame, his midsection. And go ahead and put this mix. So just in case you missed it, that's Black Templar together with Gryphcharger Grey and a small amount of water, just to cut the intensity a little bit, make it less intense. And I think that looks pretty good as a shading mixture. This is okay to, because it's in that kind of blue spectrum, it's okay to flow over into some of the cape sections. So if you want to darken certain sections of that green material a little bit more, yeah, you can just do that, and it will look just fine because it's kind of in the same family of colors anyway. So that's looking pretty good. Over the sections of his bow, yeah, if you want the metal to remain nice and shiny, we'll definitely want to come in and do some selective highlights as well, using just the pure silver that we used before from Vallejo, and I think that would get quite a good result overall. So applying it over his bow frame as well as his cuffs. So this model actually has quite, I mean, it's a relatively simple model, but it is composed of quite a fair few parts. But what I really like about this miniature is just the fact that it's, in terms of geometry, I think it's very pleasing. Like the materials kind of overlap in a very meaningful way to create a sense of a well-layered model. What I mean by this is that you've got his different fabric layers and they interact to form a miniature that makes a lot of sense. Like they overlay each other in a way that would work in real life. So very often, you know, with fantasy miniatures, you sometimes get things like a shoulder pad that looks like it isn't secure to anything. It's kind of just floating in the air. It's kind of impossible because it lacks all the straps, all the little nits and nitty-gritty details that kind of make it work as a piece of armor. So this model has none of those problems, and that's really quite pleasing to see. So we're going to add a little bit of our blue-black mixture, emphasizing the area closer to the hilt, so that it sort of has that kind of a natural shade progression from tip to base. If you overdo it like I did just there, you can come in with your finger to just take off a bit of excess paint. And let's just repeat this again on the back in case you missed it. Let's come in a little bit closer. So apply this, build it up on one side of the blade and another on the other side. If it comes across as a little bit too strong, it's okay to just take your finger and wipe off the excess. So this is how it looks on the first pass, right? A little bit messy. That's okay. But once you get onto the second pass, it starts to look a lot more controlled and a little bit neater. But that does take some time to dry in between phases. I guess the order of the day is to just, you know, take your time with it and do what you can when the time is right. And don't worry if you make a mistake, you just come back in and touch it up later. As we said many times on this channel, the model's only done when you declare it's done. And if you keep painting and keep improving, by the time you get to your fourth model, your first model will look like it could be improved. But that's just part of the learning process, nothing wrong with that. It just takes lots of time and effort. And time and effort is always easier to do, always easier to pay out if you actually enjoy the process. So take the time to experiment, enjoy the process, and yeah, don't get too hung up about every model that you paint having to be perfect. So we're coming in with a bit of silver to trim this shade. Because this model doesn't actually have the strongest blade details, you kind of need to come in and do some of it by hand. It's just how it is. Okay, we're beginning to have the shape that we want, but that can be refined later. But we can come in elsewhere and drop in a little bit more silver. I think overall this side of the blade is looking a lot more successful than the other one. So we will revisit the other one in a little while. But for now, I just want to make sure that the edges on this side look right. And then we can come in and sort of blend the silver into the recesses, so that it doesn't look quite so stark. A bit more natural looking. Okay, cool. So let's move on to applying the first of our highlights. I think the first area that I think really needs to be emphasized a little bit better is his yellow tunic. I think it's kind of gotten a little bit lost. So I'm using ice yellow. Why ice should be yellow is a bit of an in-joke, I feel, for the people at Vallejo. But yeah, a few carefully chosen streaks of this very pale yet still very saturated yellow, and that really helps us to make this area pop a little bit more. As always, if we overdo the highlights, that's okay. It's always okay to overdo the highlights and then cut back into them with the original contrast paint, because that creates a more of a smooth blend. That back and forth really helps to give us a more pleasing result at the end of the day. And if you go back and forth enough times blending this, well, frankly, you will reach a point where the human eye is no longer able to tell the transition apart, and that is how blending is done, without resorting to hard to control techniques like wet blending and so on. Let's also do a little bit more of a highlight for the brown areas. So this is your skeleton horde plus a little bit more of my silver gray. It's a little bit light, so you can go ahead and apply that onto the material of his leg, bearing in mind that it's bunching together in certain areas. creases, as you would expect to see on a part of the model that sees a lot of motion on his pants. A lot of movement and a lot of crinkling there for the material. Okay, and then we move on to his emerald cloak. And to this, I think all we really need to do is to make sure that we have a small amount of really bright highlight to draw the eye. So right along the sharpest edges, like that, and sort of like blend away the tip of it so that it sort of blends neatly. And we can apply this to frame his face. It's always a good thing. Faces and bases is the old adage of the army painter. These are the areas that you're most likely to see when miniatures are on the table en masse. So a section in between his legs, and then over here we go onto the back and sides. Really get that kind of long, fine highlights, drawing the eye. Doesn't need to be a lot of this. So really, if you're using this technique of building up colors by shading down into them rather than highlighting from a dark base up, with what I've been using has been like contrast paints, which are nice and translucent, but really any translucent paint will do the job. If you kind of build up the colors using that kind of method, then really the only highlight that you need to place is the final highlight, which is the one that's designed to draw the eye most strongly. And this really need only be placed on the most important parts of the miniature, and thereby saving you hopefully lots of time, because it's the preceding stages or highlights, where you sort of painstakingly build them up from dark, that in my opinion actually end up taking a lot of time. The final few highlights actually are quite fun and quite quick to do, as you can see. Plus, this is the most enjoyable stage of highlighting, I find. I always used to hate the first stage of highlighting because of just the sheer amount of ground you have to cover, and it's all precision work, right? So it tends to tire your eyes out really fast. So yeah, this was my preferred method to paint ever since the release of contrast paints, which made it easier for me to have translucent paints very consistently on the go. I mean, in theory, you could just mix up a bunch of paints by yourself, and that would have been fine. But this was just a fun way for me to get back into the swing of painting after a bit of a hiatus, where my productivity painting-wise was a bit lower. This was the perfect way to get back into it. I never really stopped painting, to be honest, but this quick and easy way of getting really effective colors really brought it back to life for me, and I really started to enjoy painting again. Okay, cool. So we're going to highlight the Mantis Warriors green areas. Really, this is just about redefining those edges in a similar way to what we did with the emerald green, the Eldari emerald. And along the way, you get to fix the occasional mistake, which is highly satisfying for me. Really enjoy that. Remember, if you overdo the highlights, you can always come back in, shade it back down again with more of the original contrast color. And because that tends to be, contrast paints are translucent, right? So that translucency helps you blend your new colors into the old to make the whole thing look a lot more coherent. Sometimes so much of painting is just pushing pigments around on the surface like this, back and forth until you find it looks the way you want it to look, the way you intend, and it gets really satisfying after that. So don't be afraid to go bold with your highlights, and then you can come back in and sort of trim them later on. Okay, so that's coming along. A bit more green on the front. Lighten the upper edge because it really shouldn't be so dark up there, since it's closest to the light. And clean up all the little errors that we inevitably make. And I think that's what it is that makes like painting so pleasing sometimes, is the idea that you can easily fix any mistake the moment it's dry. And sometimes it teaches us that we need a little bit of patience to let things dry before we act on a solution. Kind of just general good life advice, actually. Yeah. So because of the colors that we've been using to sort of like build up the highlights, it started to look slightly chalky, but that's okay, because we can just come back in with more Mantis Warriors green to sort of get it back to where it needs to be. So this model is easy to paint, but not easy to get looking good, because there's a lot of flat surfaces for you to really show off a bit of flair, as far as getting it to look, really precise. So let's move on to the gold. So this is the usual gold mix that I like to use. It's a combination of Nazdreg yellow for that yellow character, and Seraphim Sepia for that kind of brown character that you get in like really rich and lustrous gold. You want ideally a combination of those two pigments to kind of pull it off. So that goes over his sword hilt and blade. Well, not blade, sword hilt and pommel. And I think that works really well with the more bluish other areas. The sort of bluish sheen that we gave to all the other metal areas. So that can go down here as well, over the sort of end cap of that scabbard for his little sidearm dagger over here. And let's get some more Mantis Warriors green. Whoop. Now, no warrior, no time to take a rest. No rest for the valiant. And this Mantis Warriors green can go on almost like a thin glaze over our previous highlights to kind of get them back into the right shade again. More in the recesses. I think it's starting to look good. Okay, so let's drop in A little bit more red over his gemstones. He's got this little heart-shaped gemstones, which are kind of adorable. So there's this really big one on his chest. Or on his belt, rather. You can build up a little bit more red over his bow. So we have that nice shade from top to bottom. And yeah, this model is proving to be quite satisfying to do. There's a lot of detail though, so I can really sort of see that this is one of those models that I could spend forever refining and perfecting. It's kind of nice. But for our purposes today, I think we just want to get it to a decent standard. Give us a good base to work off when we revisit this model inevitably. And yeah, that's something that we can sort of revisit from a clean slate in the future. Really satisfying to get back into. I don't entirely understand what's going on over here. I do know that this is the hilt of his weapon. So that's fine. More red over there. But he's kind of got a rectangular sort of thing over there. Not sure what that is. I guess what we could do is we could just do it in a leather brown color. Let's assume that it's some kind of a backing for his scabbard. Like that. And I think that's fine. It's a minor enough detail that I don't think we'll be too worried about revisiting that in the future. It's just a little bit more shading for his darker brown areas. This is our Gorgrunter fur areas. And make sure that it sort of rings the lighter brown areas nicely, which we can then come in with additional highlights. To achieve that kind of balanced look. Balance meaning visually balanced, insofar as it doesn't sort of vanish into the surface. We want it to still be visible, to still appreciate that color without clashing with the overall color scheme. And that's something that, you know, like Wood Elves offer as a painting kind of opportunity. Because the nice thing about Wood Elves is that they don't really have a very strong uniform per se. Most Wood Elf miniatures can be painted, have to be painted with a variety of colors because they simply don't have that uniformity that a lot of other factions have. And that's something that really kind of reflects the way they operate on the battlefield as well in Warhammer. I like Wood Elves conceptually, I just don't think they really work very well as a Warhammer army. They're just kind of a very loose collection of skirmishers running around, which is great fun to, I guess, unleash on an unsuspecting opponent. But to be honest, didn't tend to make for very good games, simply because an army of skirmishers with ranged weapons, in my opinion, didn't really work that well when it came to the kind of mass battle game that Warhammer was in general. So frustration would tend to ensue, usually on the part of their opponents, sometimes on the part of the elf player, because, you know, to compensate for just how effective the elves were at killing things, generally speaking, they would be given very low strength and low defense, which resulted in them being absolutely wiped if the enemy could even get into base contact with them. And that kind of like high stakes, high risk, high reward kind of gameplay can either be really thrilling if you're doing well, or really frustrating if you're not. So yeah, Wood Elves were always that kind of sort of high stress army to play. I certainly like the look of the models, but I didn't really like the way they operated on the tabletop. And that's just me. I'm sure your mileage will vary. Nothing wrong with that. We can like different things and still get a lot of enjoyment out of the hobby. That's how it is. It's a tough one because I think to have meaningful interaction with your opponent, a wood elf player basically needs to risk a lot, but because they are so fragile, most of their models didn't wear armor, for instance, and a lot of the models were just not very well equipped for close combat. That risk usually ended up with the elves either getting completely pulverized as soon as anybody who could fight decently got into combat with them, or else it would tend to go the other way, wherein it just got extremely one-sided, with one side just getting picked off over the course of a battle. And I don't care how much of a fan of Warhammer you are, it's just no fun rolling armor saves for your army the entire battle. Not the most interactive experience, unfortunately, but because of the fragility of the wood elves, that's really what tended to happen. So a little bit unfortunate in that sense. The interaction wasn't ideal, but still the armies tended to look amazing, and the models themselves were really fun to paint because they were very unconventional looking. No two models were kind of dressed alike because of their lack of a uniform, and so you could have armies look really impressive because they were all painted ever so slightly differently, and there was always something to intrigue the eye no matter where you looked. Okay, the eye is giving me grief. Might be time to switch to a smaller brush. And if it doesn't come out perfect, I will refine it off camera. But really, I'm just trying to paint two white dots on a tiny little surface. And it's a little bit challenging to do this at the distances I hold my brush when doing this on camera. So that's not perfect. In fact, it's quite far from perfect. But it may be the best that I can do. Well, okay, he looks a bit psychopathic, but well, that's fine. He is a wood elf. You have to be slightly psychopathic to run into battle dressed just in your pajamas. That might be just how they roll. So a bit of AK light flesh. We add a little bit more definition to the skin areas, again using the really small brush because these areas tend to be extremely fine on elven models. Let's try that again. Don't like the way that turned out. Let's try mixing a bit of flesh wash into it. Man, this model's turning into a bit of a marathon. But he's looking so good. I'm so pleased with the way he's turning out. Kind of letting it go as long as he needs to, really. Or at least until I decide it's time to move on to the next miniature. Full concentration mode, and that's how you know I'm really focusing on this because I don't say anything suddenly for like 10 seconds. Oh, dude. I hope I've earned some measure of patience from you. Sometimes it's hard to do this on camera, but very rewarding nonetheless. You might wonder, of course, why I'm actually bothering to commit all this to recording. And the reason is because when I teach people how to paint, I think it's a lot easier for me to have some kind of a visual reference that I can share with them so that they can go in and sort of analyze what I do. Because, as is so often the case, what we say is very often not what we do, and that bedevils the process of teaching people. So this way, I don't get to hide anything from you, like the fact that I've very obviously just missed painting that heart in red. But yeah. So I'm hoping that that recording my instructional process, I guess, helps me when it comes to interrogating it, so I get better at teaching people to paint, and also committing to this format and time frame and regularity really makes it so that I learn to improve the way I discuss these topics as I paint, while trying to be relatively entertaining. Because let's face it, there are so many other things that we could choose to be doing other than painting eyes on a miniature. But I think there's something really satisfying about doing it nonetheless. So a bit of red for the heart, a bit of orange on the opposite corner. And I think he's looking pretty good. A little bit more yellow here. And now the back and forth continues. But trust me guys, I'm having a blast. Okay, so I think that's where we will stop for now. Many things that I could go into to improve further, but I think I'm kind of happy, at least on the surface, with how I've done him, or for how far I've basically gotten him to go. There are a lot of things I will continue to touch up, like maybe his blade, that heart on the back could do with a bit more work as well. But this is where we're at now. Okay guys, thanks for joining me for this. I hope you've enjoyed this process, and I hope I've convinced you to give Warhammer Quest a try, and also to delve a little bit more into Wood Elves in general as a faction, because I think they are really fascinating and they offer such a unique painting experience that's really, really nice and pleasurable to get into. Okay, have a good one. Cheers. See you in the next video. Bye.